They were inquisitive, trusting, and still malleable in their development. In the Third Reich, the National Socialists shamelessly exploited the naivety of the children.
Teachers told me that the Führer wanted the best for Germany.
Youngsters were manipulated. Human values no longer counted.
Suddenly, the call came to hate, to demand separation.
Nothing was the way it once was.
Never again do I want to experience the pain of saying goodbye to someone you know will be taken away the next day.
The horror was inconceivable.
What children experienced in those camps can never be wiped from their memories.
Children in the midst of falling bombs. In World War II, daily life had become a nightmare.
Bombs were exploding all the time.
The grown-ups clung to us and we hung on to them because everyone was terrified.
A childhood spent in chaos.
All they knew was that they had to function in this tiny segment, and they did function like clockwork.
Exploited for Hitler's insane plans, the Nazis sent child soldiers into battle.
Günter, there's one over there, get him out.
These children would never forget what they had seen at the front.
No one with any common sense would have thought this possible.
What was vaunted as heroism gave way to bloody reality.
I was paralyzed with fear. What if he pulls the trigger, I thought.
What they had experienced not only haunted soldiers, even after the war.
And then we were beaten. It was appalling.
The collapse became traumatic. Many soldiers would never forget the horror.
What did you do with the child? My God, what on earth happened to you out there?
For someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, the trauma is never over.
The evil Nazi regime had exploited and betrayed them. What has remained is the pain.
Naturally, it's incredibly hard for many of them to understand that it was all an illusion, to realize that they were lied to.
We're talking about the eternal child that cried out so loudly but was never heard because there was no time or place for that.
For the gruesome war of the adults, the youngest of all sacrificed their most precious possession.
When I had overcome my disgust, I turned over the first corpse. Doing something like that is totally alien to childhood.
In the war, you just weren't a child anymore.
The war has entered its final months. On the Western Front, the Allies are advancing on Germany kilometre by kilometre. In the East, too, Soviet forces are pushing Hitler's troops further and further back. The world has been at war for more than 5 years. Yet losses in the last 12 months of the conflict will be higher than ever before. But the Nazis decree there will be no surrender. In winter 1944, Günter was 16 years old. Despite his communist upbringing, the Nazis had managed to get him on their side. The bombing raids launched under Operation Gomorrah had cost the life of his big brother Hermann. Now Günter felt alone. He didn't feel at home with his mother, his stepfather, and his 3 half-sisters. He saw the Home Guard as the chance to get out of his cellar in the ruins of Hamburg. So he signed up as a war volunteer and was sent to a training camp in what is today the Czech Republic.
The training was brutal. We had to crawl through the snow on our stomachs and appear the next day in clean uniforms. Lord knows how we got them dry. No one helped us. We were also bullied when we cleaned our weapons. The sergeant would turn up and say, "This is filthy. There's dirt here too. Clean it again." And he'd do that 5 times. After the 5th complaint, I did nothing. Then, when I showed him my weapon, he'd say, "Now, why didn't I get that the first time?" So it was pure bullying. We had to jump on and off tanks and fetch anti-tank grenades. We had to dig foxholes left and right as wide as tanks' tracks. We then had to crouch in them, and a tank would thunder over us. When its track lifted up behind us, we'd get showered with dirt. It was horrible. I deliberately behaved as if I was retarded. So, in the end, they said I was too stupid for an anti-tank unit and transferred me to the infantry.
The boys were supposed to begin home leave before being sent to the front, but on a day in March, it all turned out differently.
A group leader came to us and said, "The Führer needs you now. Germany is in great danger. So we're all going to be transferred voluntarily to the SS." Voluntarily, we thought, how come voluntarily? We'd never once been asked. But then he said, "Any objections? Has anyone got anything to say?" But none of us dared open his mouth. In the evening, when we were all in bed, two of our group started crying. They wanted to go home.
But now there was no way back. Children were taught how to handle a weapon and then sent to kill in a merciless conflict. Most of them knew how dangerous it would be, yet still they volunteered.
Looking at the situation with sheer common sense, you could wonder how that was ever possible. One answer could be that identification with the culprits created an illusion of power vis-à-vis the feeling of total impotence.
Dr. Andreas Krüger is a child and adolescent therapist in Hamburg. In researching the origins of such traumas, he is helping to gain an understanding of why children behave the way they did.
As a dream therapist, I have found time and again that the core experience is one of powerlessness, and it is this that has to be combated on all levels, on a personal or human relationship level, or on a neurobiological level. Either I resign myself to my guilt and become the sacrificial lamb, or I go on to the attack and identify with those who are responsible for my powerlessness.
The Nazis shamelessly exploited this behavior. Children were beguiled with the myth of military heroism and sent into a hopeless struggle. Some of the experienced soldiers were appalled.
Captain Hafner was supposed to recapture an area that had already been occupied by the Russians. He had asked the SS for reinforcements, and they had sent us. "What am I supposed to do with these kids?" Hafner said. "They're much too small. Look at him there. He's not much bigger than his rifle. And his sleeves are far too long. What use is this lot?" "Well, that's all there is," he was told.
And so, in their oversized uniforms, the boys were dispatched into a life-or-death struggle. In April 1945, in many German cities, the war was already over, but that made no difference to those in power. Soldiers had to continue defending what had long been lost.
We finally took up position in Lower Austria on the Czech border. We had been there for quite a while when I was told that I was going to be trained as a sniper. At first, I couldn't shoot at all. I nearly knocked my teeth out with the recoil, but I gradually became a good shoot. One day, I was lying next to a section commander just outside our position. He was looking through his binoculars and said, "Günter, there's one back there. Get rid of him." So I calmly took aim and fired. The man threw his arms in the air and fell. I did that several times, 6 or 7 times. 2 hits were confirmed officially. I felt really guilty, but I had to do what I had been ordered.
Günter Lux was still a minor, but he had already killed. He would never have thought things would get that far. In Berlin too, winter was over. Ever since the Nazis had deported her father 2 years previously, Ruth and her little sister Esther had been living with their mother in the summer house. For months it had been bitterly cold, but the summer house had no heating.
When my sister turned 8 on March the 1st, 1945, she was already very poorly. She had septic diphtheria. My mother called a doctor, and he said at once that she needed hospital treatment, but that there was no way any transport could be organized. So despite her high temperature, she would have to walk there. My mother took her, and on March the 4th, my sister died. On the 8th, we buried her in Weißensee. The inscription on her gravestone is so pertinent. What we hold in coffins belongs to the time. What we love remains and will remain for all eternity.
Bleibt in Ewigkeit.
Four weeks later, Soviet troops reached the outskirts of the capital. The battle for Berlin had begun. Monika yet was 5 at the time and was living in the capital with her mother and elder sister. Her father, Werner, was still serving at the front, but the family had no idea exactly where. In Berlin, the last resistance offered by the Germans was in vain.
We were in the cellar, where we were always told to be very quiet. And then someone said, "The Russians are here." I clearly remember how the bolt to our air raid shelter was pushed back, and I saw the Russians standing there with their fur caps. We'd been told how terrible the Russians were, but they were really nice to us children, I must say. They made liver sausage sandwiches for us and gave us lots of other things they had. It was only later that I heard of what they did to the women. Sadly, one of them was my own mother.
In the Third Reich, the Allies were capturing one town after another. The Second World War was almost over. Countless German Wehrmacht soldiers were taken prisoner by the Allies. To avoid capture, many of the young men deserted. But in the east in particular, partisans lay in wait for them. In April 1945, Günter Lux was still with his unit.
Out of 200 men in the company, there were only 56 of us left, and we had to hold our ground in foxholes 10 meters apart. Now and then, the Russians would mount an operation to capture one of us. They needed information. They'd pull a man out of his foxhole. But if he shouted, he would be shot.
Any hope of holding the position for some time was pointless. Soviet troops would soon take the area. May the 2nd, 1945. Günter Lux was hoping that he'd soon be able to go home.
Armored infantryman Lux, I was told, I want you to collect all the ammunition that's lying around here. Tomorrow, you'll be relieved. I was given a sack and then left the command bunker. Then I heard the familiar whine of shells. I knew the difference between multiple rockets and mortars. Mortars made a kind of fluttering noise. The explosion wasn't so loud, but fragments were hurled up. And it was this fluttering that I heard. Just as I had been taught, I threw myself down, one arm in front of me, and my rifle on my left. But I was too late. The shell exploded 3 meters away from me. My chest hurt. So did my face. Something was wrong. Then a comrade came, took my rifle, and pulled me to my feet. The Russians saw this and opened fire. I got hit in the backside. It was only a grazing shot, but it gave me a large, bloody wound. Our rocket launcher unit was nearby, and they dragged me over to them and laid me on a tank. I was then taken to the field station 3 kilometers away to be patched up.
The war was in its final days. The fighting on both sides was marked by an almost inconceivable brutality. Only a few of the wounded managed to make it to a first aid post. What is more, often even the field hospitals were directly in the line of fire of the opposing forces. Günter Lux made it. On arrival at the field hospital, his fight for survival continued.
I had surgery on May the 3rd. They told me that the doctor wanted to have a quiet word with me since I was scared about going under the knife. But what he said was, you don't have to worry about your family anymore. Earlier today, Hamburg was occupied without offering any resistance. And there I was, stuck on that wretched operating table. He then slipped a mask over my face, dripped ether onto it, and told me to breathe deeply. It was awful. It made me want to gag. Don't gag, he said. Breathe and count. I got to about 5 and was gone. When I awoke, I found myself in a barn, surrounded by wailing wounded. When I was lying there in all my misery, the medical orderly came over and told me he couldn't help me. I was in a lot of pain, but only the seriously wounded were given painkillers. I didn't get anything.
Now at last he could go home. Together with other wounded soldiers, Günter Lux boarded a train.
The hospital train set off on the 3rd or 4th of May and crossed the border. We saw a sign saying Linz. Linz is in Austria, and in those days it was part of the Reich. Suddenly, the train stopped, and someone said that Linz had been occupied by the Americans. Instead of waiting or going there, the officer in charge said, "We're not going to let ourselves be captured. We're heading back." So the train had to return to the protectorate. It came to a final standstill on a siding outside Písek. The next morning, I heard cheering. I listened to the radio in Písek because I could understand a little Czech and heard the words capitulation and victory. And that was on the 8th of May. We were sitting in the train and the war was over.
In Berlin, the Soviets were taking the capital street by street. In their allotment hideout in the Berlin suburb of Wittenau, Ruth and her mother were longing for the fighting to stop.
When we heard the shooting and the sound of rockets, we knew that we wouldn't have much longer to wait.
They didn't. Hitler was now dead, and German resistance had collapsed. The capital was in Soviet hands. For Ruth, the fear and all the hoping in their hideout were over.
On May the 1st, I walked from Wittenau to Weißensee for the first time to see whether the other relatives were there.
The sisters and her mother's brother were still alive, but there was no trace of their Jewish relatives. The German armed forces capitulated. The Second World War was over. The propaganda about a 1,000-year Reich and the promises German youth would prove heroic were all lies. Everything children had believed in was now worthless.
It was a huge shock. something many youngsters just could not believe. At the same time, however, many realized it was true as they made their way through a Germany in ruins. What they saw helped them to understand what had happened, but many others, of course, found it incredibly hard to comprehend that it had all been an illusion, that they had been deceived. There is no doubt that at some time or other, many succeeded in taking the step towards renouncing everything they had been told. But that meant gaining a new angle on their own lives and on what had been important beforehand, before they had to grow up too soon. Now, another massive step towards maturity was required to say, I need to take a different view. I was duped by a regime. But that, I believe, is a maturity which only comes during the course of a lifetime.
Many soldiers were massively disillusioned, but just as many at least were relieved that the horrors of war, the killing and the dying, were now over. Günter Lux experienced the end of the war in what is now the Czech Republic. There, the wounded soldiers waited to see what would happen next.
We were lying in the hospital train. The first to arrive were Soviet soldiers. Some were tipsy from drinking vodka. They wanted to have our watches. One day, another soldier turned up and began shouting and firing like mad in the air. He then stormed into the carriage right next to where I lay and fired twice through the window. Then he put the barrel of his gun against my head. It was still hot at the front. And he started talking to me. I didn't understand a word. I had no idea what he wanted. And besides, I was paralyzed with fear. I just kept thinking, if he pulls the trigger, which was only to be expected. But he was suddenly distracted and left. My goodness, was I scared. It had been a long time since I felt that I was going to die.
The hospital train had stopped on the demarcation line in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. It was here that Soviet troops from the east met American forces advancing from the west. They were to decide together what should be done with the prisoners.
This American officer came up and said that only the most seriously wounded could stay on the train. Those who were only slightly wounded would all have to get off. The doctor protested in my case, but to no avail. As the train pulled away, we looked on wistfully. I thought of how I could have been in it on my way home. But I owe my life to the circumstances which had taken me off it. Any soldier who had been with the SS, no matter how old he was immediately shot by the border police or partisans, as they called themselves. If I had been on board, they would have shot me too.
Those who had been left behind still had no idea what fate awaited them. At home in Berlin, together with her mother and her sister, Monika Jette feared for the life of her father, Werner. They had still heard nothing from him, so they had no idea that he too had been taken prisoner.
He and 3 other soldiers had been captured by an American. Asked if they were Nazis, the others said they weren't. They were all led into a barn. My father then admitted to having been a National Socialist and was taken to one side. He thought he was going to be shot and the others spared. But the soldier then came back and said, "You told the truth, right or wrong, my country." And that is how he survived, he told us. He then became an American prisoner of war.
He remained a prisoner for weeks and months that followed. He had no contact with his family. At home, they assumed he was missing. But just like in wartime, even after the war, at first, Fear and grief were secondary. There was much to be done.
The slogan at the end of the war was, "Life must go on." You had to make sure there was food on the table. Thank God we had a big garden, which provided us with fruit and vegetables.
Children learned to come to terms with the situation. With the bombing now over, the ruins became playgrounds.
We played cops and robbers in the ruins. The boys stole non-ferrous metal. I have such incredible memories of it all. Children lived their own lives, probably in order to survive. Everyone was in some gang or other, which roamed through the ruins. I remember this one apartment which had been boarded up. We went in and found this skeleton. We were petrified and went and told the man who dealt in non-ferrous metals. "Oh, that's just a Jew they forgot," he said. And we thought, "Who is Mr. Jew? Where is he?"
Then the waiting was over. In 1946, the father and husband who had been missing for so long returned home to Berlin, to a new world Werner was not prepared for.
When my father came home, that part of Berlin where I grew up was already under American administration. To make ends meet, amongst other things, my mother washed uniforms for the Americans. As far as I know, we hadn't been told of his impending arrival. So suddenly, one day, he was there. And the first thing he saw, of course, was the American uniforms hanging ironed in the hall. The enemy's uniforms. "That has to stop," he said. Then, as a father and head of the family, he tried to ensure that we had food on the table. And he did that very well. Above all, he said, "You're going to learn something. You're going to attend good schools." Classrooms back then were all overcrowded with 40 to 50 children in one class, but he saw to it that we went to a convent school. That meant paying school fees and finding money for books and fares, but he came up with it. "We can't give you much," he said, "but we can give you a good education so that you can make something better of your lives."
Werner made sure there was money for food and school fees, but no emotional bond developed within the family. Father and daughter were strangers.
For many children born during the war, their father was first of all a stranger entering the apartment. He was a man coming back into a family which had no chance of starting at square one again. Each family member had his or her own character with their own experiences. Starting afresh just wasn't on. There were lots of family constellations which did not correspond to the mother-father-child principle. The desire might have been there to live as an intact family, but the structures were simply different. Breaches arose between parents and children, which cannot be imagined dramatically enough.
To work through what he had experienced as a soldier, Monika's father brought the war back into everyday life. He turned the house into a barracks.
Everything had to be clean and in order and done snappily. I never saw my father with dirty fingernails or sloppily dressed. He thought a lot of himself. In fact, it was this role model approach he'd been taught at the Ordensburg. I had to pass lots of tests of courage as a child. I had to jump down from sand piles, do squats and press-ups, and walk like a duck. All the things he had had to do. He did them all with me, but basically just to break my spirit. "A German child doesn't do that," he'd say. "A German child doesn't do that," but he never managed to break me. A child has only two possibilities in a situation like that: to commit suicide or become a rebel. And I became a rebel.
Werner Jetter provided for his family, but closeness to his daughter was not a priority, and he didn't stop at bullying and a rigorously strict upbringing.
In addition to this military stiffness came grand virtues like never lie. If you tell a lie once, no one will believe you again. And never allow a lie to desecrate your mouth. Lots of military stuff like that. One day he was dealing on the black market. He'd brought a suitcase with him that was full of Hershey chocolate. I'll never forget those little bars of chocolate. The suitcase looked so inviting, so I took one bar and thought no one would notice. After all, there were so many chocolate bars there. And then I took another one. As naive as I was, I crumpled up the wrapper and threw it out of the window. He then came and asked me if I had taken it. No, I said. He stared at me and asked me again, did you take it? No. So what is this then? What followed was a good hiding. He had this piece of wood with strips of leather attached. I've no idea where he got it from, and he thrashed me with it. Afterwards, I crept under the bed like a little animal. I remember my mother coming and saying, "What did you do to the child? My goodness, whatever happened to you out there?" After that, she completely cut herself off from my father. And ever since then, I have felt nothing for him. That was just too much.
It was the start of a nightmare. But it was the only time that Monika's mother experienced what her husband was capable of doing to his child.
I only ever experienced things like that when my mother wasn't there. She had a job in a hospital. I'm certain that had she been present, she would have intervened. But I never said anything. There was just that one time when he used that cat-o'-nine-tails on me, and she took him to task for it. But she couldn't have known about all the other times because I never said anything. I was far too frightened by the thought of what it might trigger off.
Monika soon came to envy those friends whose fathers had fallen in the war. Hers was not the father she had longed for.
The feeling then arose within the family that it would have been better if he had stayed away, not because he had become a bad person, but because he had had no chance to handle his wartime experiences without professional support. We have to assume that a child that experienced its father as a returnee, especially a late returnee, would be totally traumatized. And in this case, the father was even suffering from a post-traumatic stress disorder. In that situation, none of the family was able to regulate his or her stress, and the father flipped out.
In a provisional American prisoner of war camp, 16-year-old Günter Lux was waiting for his next orders. Finally, the march began, and he was heading east. The German soldiers from the field hospital were to become Soviet prisoners of war.
One day we had to march to Tabor, where there was a huge reception camp for 25,000 German soldiers. On arrival, we were met by a German officer in full uniform but unarmed, sitting next to a Soviet guard. What's going on, I wondered. This lieutenant came over and told us new arrivals that superiors had to be saluted. The war might be over, he said, but we are still the German Wehrmacht, even if we are prisoners. I thought he'd lost his marbles. But we didn't dare say anything. Just look at the state of you, he said. Each of you should at least wear an epaulette. We had all removed our epaulets, but we got them sewn back on our uniforms.
As a member of the Waffen-SS, on completion of his training, Günter had had his blood group tattooed on his upper left arm, a distinctive mark which branded him forever.
One day, the order came through that all adolescents up to the age of 16 were to be released. We all lined up, but only to hear that this order did not include members of the SS. We were told to strip to the waist and raise our arms as the officer went past. When the row in front of me had been checked, someone in front of me said, "I've already been checked, so come and swap places with me." But I didn't dare. I had no idea who might be watching. So in my misery, I just stood there. And then the officer came and said, "SS, step out."
Günter Lux remained a prisoner of war. Months passed. Back home in Hamburg, his family had no idea where he was. In April 1947, Elisabeth Kuschak received a postcard. The sender was allowed just 25 words, but it was a first sign of life. "Dear Mum, belated congratulations on your birthday. Spring has arrived here too. Lots of love from your dear son, Günter." Later, longer letters were permitted. Günter dreamt of being released and allowed to go home at last. But it would be a long time before that happened. When the war came to an end, finally so did life in their hideout for Ruth Jax and her mother. Their time spent in the cold, cramped summer house was over.
We were allocated an apartment by someone who was a party member. I myself spent only a year in it, my mother 9 months. And then Herr Lindenberg made accommodation available on his plot in Tegel, and we moved in because I didn't feel at home in someone else's house. But that had been only temporary anyway. We just needed a roof over our heads, a place with heating, where we could use a bathtub or take a shower.
The ruined streets of Berlin were soon full of life again as people built new lives for themselves. Ruth Jax also had plans for the future.
I'd only had 4.5 years primary school in my life. In 1945, I wanted to go back to school, but I wasn't allowed to. Since I was already 16, they said I no longer had any claim to schooling. I was shattered.
But Ruth didn't let her disappointment get the better of her. That same summer in 1945, she started an apprenticeship as a seamstress. But for 3 years she had been tormented by the question of where her father was, indeed whether he was still alive. Would she ever see him again? Ruth soon received an answer.
My cousin Willi, the brother of Egon, who was the first to be murdered, was the only relative to return from Auschwitz. One day he came into my uncle's shop in Weißensee. He saw me first and said hello. My uncle heard his voice and knew at once who it was. "Is that really you, Willi?" he said. We were absolutely delighted to see anyone at all. He then told us that my father had been murdered. But because he had been something of a nutcase, even as a child, I didn't believe him. My mother then told me not to be silly. "You can believe him," she said. "No, I can't," I replied. "You can say what you want, but my daddy is still alive, and he is still alive in me today."
It was true. Hermann Jax had been murdered by the Nazis. After spending 2 years in various prisoner of war camps, in 1947, Günter Lux was transferred to the Soviet capital.
I was then sent to Moscow. Tushino was something of a model camp. The conditions were fairly good. We were even able to do some acting. The director came to me and said, "You're a good-looking chap. Can you sing?" He wanted to put on an operetta. "Then you can play the woman," he said. "You could pass for one." I was asked to sing something for him, and he thought it was pretty good. They kitted me out as a woman, with a wig and everything. When I sang the part, I got tremendous applause. But I didn't do it anymore after that. I was given a bodyguard because the prisoners were suffering from a lack of female company. I had to save my skin on a few occasions. I was also given a sleeping cabin behind the stage, because in their desperation, the men thought I was a woman.
Once again, Günter's membership of the SS prevented him from returning home.
Obviously, we all wanted to go home. I had been on the returnees list twice already, but had to get off the train again before it set off. An officer appeared, looked at the list and said, "Looks, Günter, German, SS, out." So I had to go back and work. I swore that wouldn't happen to me again. It was just too hard to take. In my thoughts, I was already back home. And then that.
Hope of ever being back in Hamburg with his family dwindled. 19-year-old Günter remained in the camp and had to continue rebuilding Moscow. In summer 1949, he was working on a construction site in Moscow.
Next to the construction site were some houses that had been completed. People were already living in them. One day I saw a girl looking out of the window. She was really pretty, and I hadn't seen a woman for a long time. You could give her a wave, I thought, and so I did. When she gave me a quick wave back, I thought, that's a start. Now you have to continue. I worked there every day, always in the hope of seeing her standing there again.
The girl was called Valja. Next to the fence enclosing the prisoners, she tended an overgrown garden.
One day I went over. She was standing there, weeding her radishes. "Nice plants," I said, but I really couldn't have cared less. "May I touch your hands?" I asked. She then came over to the wire mesh fence and pressed her hands against it. I did the same from my side. It was such a wonderful feeling, one I had not had for such a long time. "Well, that's enough for now," she said, and left.
Günter often met Valja by the fence. Soon they wanted to be closer. Günter had befriended one of the Soviet guards and asked him for advice. Yorka managed to smuggle him out of the building site, enabling Günter to meet Valja in her parents' summer house.
2 hours, he told me, and then you have to return. I went into the summer house with her, and we had a nice chat, as it were. She made me swear not to tell anyone what happened between us, and I intend to keep that promise even today.
Günter fell in love with the 16-year-old. At last, he had known happiness. He was even prepared to give up his homeland for Valja.
I told the camp commandant that I wanted to stay in the Soviet Union. "I have met a girl," I said, "and I want to marry her." When you are together with a girl and you promise marriage, then you have to keep your word. At first, he was sympathetic, but then he said, "That's out of the question. You are a fascist, and she is a Bolshevik girl. We could never tolerate that." The next day, I was transferred to another work unit and never saw her again.
Their love never stood a chance. Only a few months later, Günter was suddenly allowed to return home.
One day, it was Christmas Eve, we had to assemble by the gate. Then, for the last time, the officer said, "Lux, Günter, German, get on board." And then I was off home.
Together with his friend Edgar, Günter Lux travelled back home to his native Hamburg.
When we pulled into the station, everything was so familiar. There were crowds of people. They showed us pictures. "Do you know him? Does anyone know him?" Then I heard someone shout out, "Günter!" It was my mother. She ran up to me and said, "I'm so glad you're so big. And you were so small when you left." Then we went home.
In Berlin, Monika Jette had suffered from her father's constant rages ever since his return 6 years previously. He bullied the child and even beat her. Her daily nightmare only came to an end after she turned 11, because then, as a travelling salesman, her father was rarely at home. As a child, her father's behaviour was incomprehensible, but today Monika can explain it.
Basically, when he returned from the war, my father was severely traumatized. My situation, I think, was no different from that of many other children. That as a father, he was emotionally unreachable. Naturally, like every soldier who sadly had to serve in the war, what he had experienced had brutalized him. And in addition to this psychological aspect, which had thoroughly demoralized him, there was this all-for-nothing element. He had imagined his life quite differently. "If I had been a Junker, we would have had horses," he'd say. "You'd have been able to ride, and we would have had a fabulous life." This is what he imagined for us.
But even an explanation cannot alleviate the pain. Monika Jette can understand her father, but she cannot forgive him.
But the terrible thing about this story is the tremendous disappointment you carry inside you, especially as a girl. Her father is the first man in a girl's life, so you want to love him, and you want him to love you. If you don't get that, you have a deficit your whole life long. Later, when you have a partner, you hope that this partner will make up for this deficit. But there you will find warmth and the acceptance that you will be loved solely for who you are, that you don't have to make an effort or pass some test of courage in order to be loved.
When she was barely 17, Monika moved out of her parents' home. She felt homesick, but only for her beloved mother. When she passed away in 1996, Monika could no longer avoid contact with her father.
When he was dying, I cared for him until he drew his last breath. On his deathbed, his hand reached out for mine. "Don't you love me just a little bit?" he asked. I was stunned. I felt nothing. But I quickly said, "Yes, I do." That's enough when you're close to death, I thought. But for life, it would not have been enough. I found it really hard to handle the fact that he had got me to make a confession of love. I couldn't really grieve when he died, because inside I was simply dead along with him.
For many years, Ruth consciously avoided the darkest chapter in her life. She got married and wanted only to look to the future. She suppressed the pain.
Whenever I thought about that time, I used to break down in tears and start shaking. It was absolutely awful. I hardly ever spoke about it.
Her cousin Willi returned from Auschwitz. He was the only one. Ruth never saw any of her Jewish relatives again. For a long time, she refused to accept the reality.
Right up until 1948, whenever I saw a man who looked like my father, I'd run up to him. Then, oh dear, it's not him. Although I knew that he had been killed, I refused to believe it. And that was how it stayed until the day in 1968, when I sailed to Israel. And the ship's barman said to me, "I know you, even though we've never met before. Your father was called Hermann, and he and I were together in Morowitz." He took me under his wing as his son and looked after me as long as he was alive. Because you have the same looks and, above all, the same movements and gestures as your father, I knew at once who you were.
It was only then, 23 years after the end of the war, that Ruth could start opening herself up to the reality of her father's death and come to terms with the loss. Life has to go on, and the past will not be discussed. That was the basic principle in many German households after the end of the war. But the pain, the guilt, and the suffering remained. Feelings that had been overwhelmingly present for so long were buried deep in the soul. Never again should they surface.
In my opinion, with the whole generation traumatized, you can't say to someone, "Tell me, was it that terrible?" It is actually a natural impulse to say, "Open up, let me know how you feel." And it is what that person who was asked would normally like to do. But he tried it once and got these flashbacks. So henceforth he will avoid the issue like a horse shies away from fire, even though he would like nothing more than to describe his experiences. But he can't. The mega stress this would cause, the moment he remembered, would completely shatter him. And that makes him silent, mute, and bitter.
I can only say that alcohol, the old devil, played a role. I drank a lot to blot it out. After I had been drinking, things were basically all right again. It stopped me thinking about it all.
Günter soon found happiness at last. In 1952, at a party in Hamburg-Horn, he met Doris. It was love at first sight. 3 years later, they got married.
We've been a married couple since 1955. Marriage gave me stability. Our son was born, but in the end, we had other worries.
Back then, Günter only looked to the future. He suppressed the past.
Not having to deal with their own personal loss was something many wished for. But in the long term, it became impossible. In old age, their sorrow caught them up after all, because it belonged to their inner reality and biography, and because the war made probably the biggest biographical impact that anyone could ever have experienced.
And that also held true for Günter Lux. His experiences caught up with him years later. He started to write everything down and tell classes of school children about his turbulent life.
Youngsters have to draw their own conclusions, but I believe they have a right to experience at first hand what everything was like and why everything happened the way it did. And I want to make my contribution to this.
60 years passed before Ruth Winkelmann was in a position to come to terms with the past. In 2005, she began to put her memories down on paper. The exchange with other people helped her to reflect on her experiences.
There are lots of things that emerge whenever I give a reading. That's because realizations still come to me, even today. Someone asked me what feelings November the 9th triggered off in me. I thought for a long time and said it meant the end of my childhood. That was the moment when I became an adult. No doubt about it.
Monika Jetta has also come to terms with the past. She embarked on a course of therapy and reconstructed her father's journey through life. It was an attempt at reconciliation.
I had these pounding headaches. Something needed to be got out. But I don't have that anymore. I sometimes have nightmares, but not as bad as in the past. And I have also made peace with my parents. In that respect, there is no bogeyman haunting me anymore. In the past, whenever I visited my mother's grave, he was there too. They were buried together. But I did not want to visit him. Today, though, I can go there and visit both of them. And in some way there is solace in that. I no longer go there with a heavy heart. I visit them both. And that's fine.
A childhood spent in wartime does not end with a peace treaty. Their experiences shape children forever. The memories remain an entire lifetime. The suppressed images, the unspoken words, are there no matter how deep they are buried. The scars on their childhood soul might fade one day, but the pain remains.